Jake didn't sign up for this kind of adventure. All he wanted was a nice, easy mission, scan a few planets, take some notes, and maybe nap in the pilot's seat. But now, he was stranded on a planet that felt like it had been designed by someone who hated happiness. The sky was a constant murky red, like it couldn't decide whether to storm or catch fire. The ground. Sharp, black rocks everywhere. And let's not forget the fun bonus feature. Explosions in the distance. Jake figured they weren't exactly fireworks. His shuttle was toast. Smoke still poured out of it. He had no choice but to explore. His survival kit was running low, and he needed food, water, and something that wouldn't explode under his boots. Jake climbed over a ridge, muttering to himself, "Why does it always have to be the crazy planets? Why couldn't I crash on the one with nice beaches and tropical drinks?" That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was just a pile of metal or some alien tech, lying broken on the ground. But then it moved. It was a person. Or, well, something person-shaped. A tall, armored figure, slumped against a jagged rock. Jake crouched and crept closer. His heart pounded as he gripped the handle of his blaster. It was either a survivor or something that wanted to eat him. Either way, he wasn't taking chances. The figure groaned. That was when Jake realized it was a female alien, and she wasn't just big, she was huge. Her body was covered in deep blue scales that shimmered faintly, even under the dull red sky. Long, sharp horns curled back from her head, like a crown. Her armor was cracked, her arms bleeding from jagged cuts. Hey," Jake said, lowering his blaster slightly. "You? Okay there." The alien warrior's eyes flickered open. They glowed faintly, yellow, piercing, like she could see right through him. She bared sharp teeth in what might have been a snarl or maybe a smile. It was hard to tell. "Human," she growled, her voice deep and rough, like grinding stones. "What are you doing here?" Jake blinked. "You know what humans are." The alien didn't answer. Instead, she tried to push herself up, but collapsed with a pained grunt. She was too injured to move. Jake sighed. "Great, just what I needed. An alien warrior who looks like she could crush me with one hand, and I'm the guy stuck babysitting." He knelt beside her, ignoring his own fear. "All right, stay still. Let me check those wounds." The alien's glowing eyes narrowed. "You would help me?" "Do I have a choice?" Jake said, rummaging through his backpack. "If I leave you here, you're toast. And if you die, something tells me your buddies are gonna come looking for whoever didn't help. So let's call this self-preservation." He pulled out a medkit, hands fumbling slightly. The cuts on her arms were deep, but the bleeding had slowed. He applied a disinfectant patch, which sizzled slightly on contact with her scaled skin. The alien hissed in pain, but didn't flinch. "You are strange," she muttered. "Yeah, I get that a lot," Jake replied. "Hold still." As he worked, the ground trembled. In the distance, a low, rumbling noise grew louder. It sounded like engines. The alien's head snapped up. "They're coming," she said, her voice sharper now. "Who's coming?" Jake asked, looking around nervously. "My enemies," she growled. "They want me dead. And now, they'll want you dead too." Jake froze. "Oh, fantastic. That's just fantastic. I saved your life, and now I'm on some alien hit list." The alien gave a faint, humorless smile. "You should have run while you had the chance, human." Before Jake could reply, the rumbling grew deafening. 3 alien vehicles crested the ridge, spiky, black machines that hovered above the ground, bristling with weapons. "Oh, come on," Jake shouted, grabbing his blaster. The alien warrior reached out and grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries. "You are no match for them," she said. "Leave me. Save yourself." Jake shook his head. "Not happening. I didn't drag you back from the brink just to let these guys finish the job." He scanned the terrain, looking for an escape route. His eyes landed on a narrow ravine nearby. It was risky, but it might buy them some time. "All right, listen up," Jake said. "Can you walk?" The alien hesitated, then nodded. "Barely." "Good enough. Let's move." He slung her arm over his shoulder, grunting under her weight. She was taller than him by at least a foot, and her armor didn't help. But Jake wasn't about to give up now. The two of them hobbled toward the ravine as the enemy vehicles roared closer. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, striking the ground behind them. Jake swore under his breath. Do these guys ever miss? The alien warrior gave a weak chuckle. "You are. Amusing." "Glad you think so," Jake muttered. "Now keep moving." They reached the ravine just as the enemy vehicles opened fire again. The rocks around them exploded in showers of dust and debris. Jake pulled the alien down behind a boulder, shielding her with his body as the blasts rained down. "You're insane," the alien said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Yeah, well," Jake said, "if we survive this, you can tell everyone about the crazy human who saved your scaly butt." The alien stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Agreed." Jake peeked out from behind the boulder, his mind racing. He spotted a narrow path winding through the ravine. A way out, if they were fast enough. "All right," he said, turning back to the alien. "Here's the plan. We run. Don't stop, don't look back. Got it?" She nodded, her glowing eyes steady despite the chaos around them. Jake took a deep breath. "Okay. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They bolted from their cover, running as fast as they could. Plasma bolts continued to rain down, but the narrow walls of the ravine provided some cover. Jake's lungs burned, and his legs felt like jelly, but he didn't stop. Finally, they emerged from the other side of the ravine, leaving the enemy vehicles behind. Jake collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The alien warrior sank down beside him, her expression unreadable. "You are unexpected," she said after a long silence. Jake glanced at her. "I'll take that as a compliment." The alien nodded. "You saved me. Twice now." "Yeah, well," Jake said, "I'm just full of bad decisions today." The alien's lips curled into what might have been a smile. "My name is Vishala," she said. "I owe you a debt, human." Jake raised an eyebrow. "A debt?" Vishala nodded. "In my culture, a life saved must be repaid. You have earned my loyalty." Jake sighed. "Great, just what I needed. A giant, deadly alien warrior following me around." Vishala's smile widened, showing sharp teeth. "You should be honored." Jake groaned, but deep down, he couldn't help feeling a strange sense of relief. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Jake wasn't exactly used to gratitude, especially from 7-foot-tall alien warriors. He'd been thanked before, by coworkers, family, and the occasional stranded space tourist, but never in the way Vishala did it. This was something else entirely. It started when they found shelter in the caves, a temporary break from the chaos of the hostile planet. Jake was patching up his own scrapes with the last of his medkit supplies when Vishala stood over him, her glowing yellow eyes fixed on his face. "You have done more than anyone has ever done for me," she said, her deep voice carrying an odd weight. "It is my duty to repay you." Jake stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. "Oh, you don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would do." "Incorrect." Vishala knelt down, her massive frame towering over him even when crouched. "Your kind is not known for such actions. Most humans would have left me to die." Jake scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well, I guess I'm not most humans." Vishala nodded solemnly. "That is why you must accept my life boon." Jake blinked. "You're what now?" "A life boon," Vishala repeated. She straightened up, standing to her full, imposing height. Her horns nearly brushed the low ceiling of the cave. "When a Drexian life is saved, we pledge ourselves to the Savior. It is a sacred tradition." Jake chuckled nervously. Oh no, no, you don't have to do that. Really, it's fine. Just, I insist, Vishala said, cutting him off. You may choose whatever you desire. Wealth, power, protection. She hesitated, her voice dropping to a quieter tone. Even progeny. Jake froze. Progeny. He tilted his head, hoping he'd misheard. Wait, what does that mean? Vishala's glowing eyes locked onto his. A child, she said simply. I offer you my offspring. Jake stared at her, his brain doing somersaults. Hold on a second. Are you saying you want me to father a kid with you? Yes, Vishala replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. Jake's jaw dropped. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. Finally, he managed. Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Humans don't do things like that so casually. I mean, we usually. He paused, searching for the right words. There's dating. And talking. And knowing each other for more than a day before. Well, you know. Vishala tilted her head, clearly confused. Dating, yeah, Jake said. It's like spending time with someone, getting to know them, seeing if you're compatible. She frowned. Compatible? You saved my life. That proves you are worthy. What more compatibility is needed? Jake groaned, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple. Humans don't just decide these things based on life-saving incidents. Vishala's gaze narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he'd offended her, but then she nodded thoughtfully. I see. Human customs are inefficient. Inefficient, Jake repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Vishala said. Among my people, actions speak louder than words. You risked your life for mine. That is all the proof I need of your worthiness. Jake sighed. Look, I'm flattered. Really, I am. But I'm just a guy. A regular, average guy. I'm not worthy of anything. Vishala stepped closer, her imposing presence making the small cave feel even smaller. You underestimate yourself, human. Your courage and resourcefulness saved me. That is not average. Jake felt his face heat up. Well, I mean, I just didn't want to leave you there to die. It wasn't a big deal. It was a very big deal, Vishala said firmly. And you will accept my gratitude, whether you wish to or not. Jake threw up his hands. Fine. Okay, I accept your gratitude. But let's maybe leave the whole progeny thing out of it, all right? Vishala's lips curled into what might have been a smile. As you wish, human. For now. Jake groaned, muttering under his breath. This day just keeps getting weirder. Later that evening, as they sat by the small fire Jake had managed to build, the conversation turned to lighter topics, or at least, Jake tried to steer it that way. So, you said your name was Vishala, right? He asked, poking at the fire with a stick. That's a nice name. What's it mean? Vishala tilted her head, considering his question. It is an old Drexian word. It means unyielding flame. Jake raised an eyebrow. Fitting. You definitely don't seem like the type to back down from a fight. She nodded, her expression proud. And your name, human. What does it mean? Jake. He shrugged. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just Jake. Vishala frowned. Your name holds no meaning. How strange. Among my people, names carry great weight. Yeah, well, Jake said, humans aren't exactly known for being deep and meaningful. We're more about sarcasm and bad decisions. Bad decisions, Vishala repeated, her tone thoughtful. Perhaps, but your decision to save me was not bad. Jake smiled faintly. Thanks, I guess. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire filling the cave. Outside, the distant sounds of explosions and engines had finally faded. For the first time since he'd crash-landed, Jake felt a tiny bit of peace. But of course, it didn't last long. Human, Vishala said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I have been thinking." "That's never good," Jake muttered, earning a sharp look from her. "I believe you would make an excellent Drexian warrior," she continued, ignoring his comment. "Your quick thinking and bravery are rare qualities." Jake snorted. "Me? A warrior? Not likely. I'm more of a runaway and hope for the best kind of guy." "And yet you did not run when faced with danger," Vishala pointed out. "You stood your ground. That is the mark of a true warrior." Jake rolled his eyes. "If you say so." "I do," Vishala said firmly. "You have earned my respect, human, and that is no small thing." Jake looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Well, thanks. I guess I'll try not to let it go to my head." Vishala's lips twitched in what might have been another smile. "See that you do not. A Drexian warrior must remain humble." Jake chuckled. "Humble, ha. I'll keep that in mind." As the fire burned lower and the cave grew darker, Jake found himself thinking about Vishala's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't as average as he thought. After all, how many humans could say they'd saved an alien warrior's life? But then he remembered the whole progeny thing and groaned. "What have I gotten myself into?" he muttered. Vishala glanced at him, her glowing eyes gleaming in the dim light. Something great, human. Something great. Jake wasn't so sure. But one thing was certain. Life with Vishala was going to be anything but boring. Jake was starting to feel like he had no business being alive. First, he crash-landed on an alien planet. Then he saved an alien warrior, Vishala, from a near-death experience. And now, they were stuck on a hostile world, with warlords hunting them down. How did this all happen in just a few days? He couldn't even keep track anymore. It had only been hours since they'd escaped the initial ambush, but already, the situation was looking worse than ever. They were hiding in an abandoned cave system, one that seemed to stretch endlessly, full of narrow tunnels and dead ends. They had to keep moving. The last thing Jake needed was to be cornered in a cave by armed alien thugs. Jake sat down for a moment to catch his breath, wiping sweat off his forehead. Vishala stood beside him, her piercing yellow eyes scanning the surrounding area. Even in a state of exhaustion, she was a force to be reckoned with, towering, powerful, and ready for anything. Her blood-red armor shimmered faintly, almost like it was alive, and Jake could see the muscles under her skin flexing as she moved. Vishala turned to Jake, her gaze still focused on the entrance to the cave. "They are close. We must move quickly." Jake stood up, grabbing his blaster from where he had laid it down. "Yeah, I figured that out when I heard the explosions a few minutes ago. How long until they find us?" Vishala's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp as a hawk's. "Not long. They are skilled hunters, but we have the advantage of the terrain. If we can move through the caves quietly, they will not catch us." Jake wasn't so sure. He had seen enough of the Drexian warlords' tactics to know that they didn't give up easily. They had powerful tracking devices, highly trained soldiers, and weapons that could turn entire villages into dust. And now, they were chasing him and Vishala. "Great. All right," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We need to move fast. The last thing we need is a direct confrontation. We'll take the tunnels as far as we can, and then we find an escape route." Vishala nodded. "Agreed. But be ready to fight if we are discovered." Jake gulped but said nothing. If they were discovered, there was no way he could outrun these warlords. They'd have to fight, and Jake wasn't exactly feeling like a hero at that moment. Sure, he had managed to save Vishala once, but that had been a fluke. Fighting an entire group of armed aliens was a whole different level. The two of them moved through the caves, Vishala leading the way. Jake followed closely behind, trying his best to keep quiet, but his heart was pounding like a drum. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this tense. The walls of the cave seemed to close in on him, making every step feel heavier than the last. After what felt like hours of winding through narrow passageways, they finally reached a small open area. The air was thick with dust, and Jake could barely see more than a few feet in front of him. The dim glow of Vishala's armor was the only thing that kept him from losing track of her completely. "This should be a good spot to rest," Vishala said, her voice low. She turned to Jake, her expression unreadable. "We will need to make a plan before we move forward." Jake sank to the ground, trying to steady his breathing. "Yeah, I'd like a plan that doesn't involve getting blown up." Vishala's lips twitched slightly, as if she were trying to suppress a smile. "I will do what I can to ensure we remain undetected. You, human, must rely on your creativity." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Creativity?" "Yes," she said, her voice as serious as ever. "You are resourceful. When I was injured, you found a way to help me with nothing but basic tools. You think quickly in dangerous situations. I believe this will be necessary if we are to survive." Jake wasn't sure if he was flattered or terrified. He was just a guy who'd been lucky so far. But maybe Vishala had a point. His mind was racing through ideas, trying to figure out how they could escape the warlords. They had no real backup, no way to call for help. It was just him and Vishala against the galaxy, and somehow he didn't feel as helpless as he thought he would. "I can work with that," Jake said, getting to his feet again. "But we'll need a distraction. Something big." Vishala nodded. "A distraction will draw their attention, but we must also be ready to move quickly once they are focused on it." Jake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "All right, here's the plan. We rig up a few of these old cave walls with explosives. If we time it right, the explosions will cause enough chaos to force the warlords to go after the noise. While they're distracted, we make a run for it." Vishala studied him for a long moment, and Jake could tell she was weighing the idea. Finally, she nodded. "It is a risky plan, but it may work. However, we must be prepared for failure." Jake grinned. "I'm starting to think that failure is my middle name at this point. But hey, if we're going down, let's go down with style." Vishala's lips curled into what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell. "I like your spirit, human." Jake grabbed the last of his explosives from his pack, setting to work quickly. Vishala helped by using her strength to place the devices in the perfect spots along the walls of the cave. It wasn't long before they had rigged up several areas that would collapse or explode when triggered. They moved swiftly, keeping their footsteps light and their voices low. Every so often, Jake could hear the faint sounds of footsteps echoing through the tunnels, a reminder that the warlords were getting closer. As they finished, Jake gave a quick glance around. "All right, here goes nothing." He pressed the detonator, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then the first explosion ripped through the cave, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The walls cracked and groaned, dust flying into the air as chunks of rock fell from the ceiling. Jake and Vishala didn't hesitate. They sprinted through the chaos, the echoes of the explosions reverberating behind them. Their hearts were racing, but neither of them slowed down. The plan was working. They had the warlord's attention. But the cave was narrow, and the explosions were only making things more dangerous. As they ran, Jake could hear more explosions, smaller ones, echoing from behind them. They were being chased. Fast. "Vishala, move!" Jake shouted. His legs were burning, and his mind was racing. They rounded a corner, but in the distance, Jake could see the outlines of the warlord vehicles. The warlords weren't giving up. Vishala glanced at him, her expression grim. "We will have to fight." Jake's stomach twisted. He wasn't ready to fight an entire battalion of alien soldiers, but there was no other choice. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." They dropped to the ground, taking cover behind the rocks. Jake fired off a few shots, hitting one of the vehicles in the engines. It exploded in a fiery burst, sending the warlords scattering in every direction. Shayla followed up with a series of deadly strikes, using her strength and weapons to cut down the soldiers who tried to charge at them. Jake couldn't help but be impressed by the way she moved, fast, efficient, and utterly lethal. But even with their combined efforts, the warlords weren't backing down. More and more soldiers appeared from the shadows, weapons raised, and it was becoming clear that they were getting outnumbered fast. "We need to move now," Jake shouted. Shayla nodded, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward another tunnel. The warlords were closing in, but they had one last chance to escape. As they ran, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. Maybe he wasn't just running for his life anymore. Maybe he was fighting for something more. "Hold on," Jake shouted. They had one more chance. It was now or never. Jake had never been more relieved in his life. After narrowly escaping the Drexian warlords in the cave system, the last thing he expected was to find a group of humans alive and well on this alien planet. But here they were, people who, just like him, had crash-landed and managed to survive. They stood around a makeshift campfire in a secluded area, the warmth from the flames casting long shadows against the rocky walls. The air felt fresh here, untouched by the chaos they had just escaped. Jake had no idea how they'd managed to find this place, but he wasn't about to question it. All he knew was that after days of running for his life, he finally felt like he could take a breath. Shayla, ever vigilant, stood off to the side, keeping a close watch on the newcomers. Her gaze never wavered from the group of humans. Jake could tell that she was still suspicious of them. She wasn't used to trusting anyone. "Are you sure they're like me?" Jake asked, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. Shayla's yellow eyes flickered in his direction. "They are human, yes, but I would be cautious. Their presence here suggests that they, too, are not without a fight. It could be a trap." Jake frowned. He had thought about that possibility, too. But something told him these humans weren't his enemies. They looked tired, just like him. Survivors of a crash, struggling to stay alive in a hostile environment. As they approached the camp, one of the humans, a tall man with a dark beard and serious eyes, stepped forward. He had a weathered look to him, as though he'd seen things that most people would never want to. His clothes were torn, his face dirty, but he still had a presence that made Jake take him seriously. "You're human," the man said, his voice hoarse but filled with curiosity. "You're alive." Jake felt a sense of recognition, but wasn't sure where he'd seen the man before. "Yeah, I'm human, Jake, just trying to survive like everyone else." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Jake up and down. Finally, he nodded, as if coming to some sort of silent conclusion. "I'm Marcus," he said, offering his hand. Jake took it, shaking Marcus's hand firmly. "Good to meet you. I didn't think I'd find anyone else out here." "Most don't," Marcus replied, glancing at Shayla, who was still standing several feet away, watching them intently. "I see you've made a friend," he said, his tone skeptical. "A big one." Jake couldn't help but chuckle nervously. "Yeah, that's Shayla. She saved my life, actually." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask more. Instead, he gestured for Jake to sit by the fire. "Well, we got a lot to talk about. And you're right about one thing. It's been a long time since we've met anyone who wasn't trying to kill us." "Yeah, I know that feeling," Jake said, sitting down on one of the nearby rocks. "What's your story? How did you guys end up here?" Marcus's expression grew serious. He sat down beside Jake, rubbing his hands together to warm them by the fire. "We were part of a recon mission. A group of us, soldiers, sent out here to check out some strange readings. At first, we thought it was just a planet with some odd atmospheric anomalies, but then we started getting attacked by these things. Warlords, aliens, whatever you want to call them. We got separated during a skirmish, and I haven't seen most of the others since." Jake winced. "That sounds rough. I barely survived an encounter with them myself." Vishela took a step forward at the mention of the warlords, her posture shifting into something more defensive, though she remained silent. Jake noticed the tension in the air between them. "They're everywhere on this planet," Marcus continued, his voice low. "The warlords, I mean. They've got control of most of the land, and it's only getting worse. But we're trying to regroup. You're welcome to stay with us for a while." Jake glanced at Vishala, unsure of what to do. He didn't know these people, but then again, he didn't know Vishala either when he first helped her. He could sense that she was uneasy around them, but he also knew she wasn't as quick to trust as he was. "We appreciate it," Jake said, looking back at Marcus. "But we're kind of on the run right now. I don't know how long we'll be able to stay." Marcus nodded. "I get it. But if you need supplies, we can help. We've managed to scavenge enough to survive. But it's not much. And if the warlords are still looking for you—" He let his words hang in the air, his eyes glancing toward Vishala. "It might be a while before you're in the clear." Jake hesitated. He'd been on the move for so long that the thought of resting in one place felt foreign. But maybe Marcus had a point. They needed supplies, and these humans had already shown that they knew how to survive. "I appreciate it," Jake said finally. "We'll stay for a little while, but only if it's safe. We don't want to bring any trouble to your camp." Vishala stepped closer, her large form looming like a shadow. "We can't afford to be complacent," she said in her deep voice. "There is danger even here." Marcus looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "I know. We've got sentries posted. But even so, we need to be careful." Jake raised his hands, trying to ease the tension between the two. "We're not here to cause trouble, just trying to figure out how to survive this mess." "Fair enough," Marcus said, leaning back and staring into the fire. "We'll keep the camp quiet, but you should know, we're not alone out here. The warlords have been hunting us for a while now, and there are others, too. Some of them are less friendly." Jake frowned. "Others?" Marcus looked around at the group sitting by the fire. There were 5 humans in total. Marcus, a woman named Ellie who looked like she'd been through her fair share of battles, a young man named Oliver who was always scanning the area nervously, and a couple of others who hadn't spoken much yet. There's a group of survivors. Some are more aggressive. They've been taking what they can from anyone who's left, and we've had a few run-ins with them," Marcus explained. "We can't trust everyone out here." Jake nodded slowly. He had a feeling that the tension between the humans wasn't just about the warlords. It seemed like there were deeper issues, too, problems that had nothing to do with the aliens or the planet they found themselves on. "All right," Jake said, rubbing his face. "We'll figure this out. But first things first, can you point me to where I can get some rest?" Marcus stood up, gesturing for Jake to follow. "Sure. We got a few shelters set up around here. Not much, but it'll do for now." As they walked away from the fire, Jake felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. These were humans, but they weren't like anyone he had ever met before. The hardships they'd endured had shaped them, made them different. They weren't the same as the people Jake knew back home, but they still shared the same basic instincts for survival. Vishala stayed behind, watching them with a suspicious gaze. She had her reasons for not trusting these people, and Jake couldn't blame her. But they were all in this together now, whether they liked it or not. As Jake lay down in the small shelter that Marcus had shown him, his mind raced. He wasn't sure where all of this was going, but he knew one thing for certain. Things were about to get even more complicated. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the warlords were only the beginning of their troubles. Jake sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The warmth was a small comfort compared to the cold uncertainty that seemed to follow him everywhere now. His thoughts kept drifting back to Vishala, who, despite all their close calls and shared dangers, had become his most trusted ally. And yet, as much as he appreciated her strength and her unwavering focus, there was something else that hung between them, a feeling that was far more complicated than just survival. Shayla had saved him, time and time again, but there was something in her eyes, something almost personal. It made Jake wonder, what did she see in him? Why had she gone out of her way to protect him? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling from the edge of the camp. He looked up, startled. For a moment, he thought it was his shadow moving. But then he saw her, Vishala, standing just outside the circle of firelight, her dark eyes glowing faintly in the night. "Can't sleep?" Jake asked, his voice low but warm. Vishala didn't answer immediately. She was always a woman of few words. Instead, she stepped closer, the red armor of hers reflecting the flickering light. There was something about her presence that felt both calming and dangerous at the same time, like she was a storm held together by sheer willpower. "Sleep is for the weak," she said finally, her voice just above a whisper. "I have no need for it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I think we both know that's not true. Everyone needs rest." Shayla's lips curled into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile, but it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps, but the world is full of enemies. I cannot afford to lower my guard." Jake nodded, not sure how to respond. The weight of their situation was beginning to sink in more than ever. They weren't just running from the Drexian warlords now. They were also trying to navigate a world full of other humans who were just as desperate to survive. There were groups who seemed peaceful, like Marcus's crew, and others who seemed to have lost all sense of humanity in the fight for resources and survival. And then there was the matter of the two of them. Jake wasn't just a stranger to Vishala anymore. He'd seen her vulnerability, when she had been injured and needed his help. She had shown a side of herself that few had probably ever seen. Still, there was more to their relationship than simple survival. He could feel it. A question burned in the back of his mind. He had to ask it, even though part of him feared what her answer might be. "Vishala," Jake started slowly, unsure how to phrase it. "Why did you save me? I mean, why risk everything for a stranger like me?" Vishala turned toward him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. For a moment, she said nothing, and Jake wondered if he had asked too much. But then she spoke. "Your species is different," she said, her voice softer now, but still filled with that same steely determination. "I have seen the way you think, the way you adapt. You do not give up, even when faced with impossible odds. You act when others hesitate. It is admirable." Jake felt a strange warmth spread through him. It wasn't much, but coming from her, it was more than he had ever expected. "I guess I've had to adapt a lot," he said with a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm not exactly a soldier. I'm just trying to survive like everyone else." Vishala's eyes softened, just for a brief moment. "Survival is a difficult thing for any species," she said, her tone distant, as if she were reflecting on something much deeper. "For my people, it has been a struggle for centuries. But your species, you have a unique strength. You fight with something that cannot be seen. Something that comes from your heart, not your fists." Jake didn't quite understand what she meant, but he felt a strange connection in her words. Maybe there was something about him that Vishala saw, something that mattered to her. But was it just survival? Or was there more to it? Before he could ask, a young voice broke the silence. "Are you two talking about me?" Jake turned quickly, startled to see a small figure emerging from the shadows. It was a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She had wide, curious eyes, and her skin was a mix of dark brown and some lighter tones that reminded Jake of something otherworldly. The girl had been hiding in the shadows of the camp for a while, and Jake hadn't noticed her until now. She had a quiet, almost ethereal presence about her, and she seemed like someone who was used to moving unnoticed. Vishala's expression shifted from quiet contemplation to immediate concern. "Lyra," she said, her voice almost a growl. "What are you doing out here?" Lyra gave a mischievous grin and stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the dirt. "I heard you talking. I wanted to know what about." She looked at Jake, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jake shook his head slowly, unsure how to respond. "No, I'm not. I'm Jake. And you're Lyra, right?" The girl nodded enthusiastically, bouncing on her feet. "Yes, I'm Lyra. I was the first one from our group to make it to the camp after the crash. Everyone else, they didn't make it." Her face dropped for a moment, and Jake could tell the loss weighed on her more than she let on. Fischela knelt beside the girl, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You should be resting. You are still young. It is dangerous out here." Lyra looked up at Fischela with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "But I'm not a child anymore. I can help. I can fight." Jake's eyes widened. "How old are you?" Lyra flashed him a grin. "Old enough to take care of myself, and I don't need anyone's protection. Besides," she said, tilting her head toward Fischela, "she's been busy watching over you." Fischela's gaze softened for just a moment before she stood up, stepping back. "I watch over those who need it," she said simply. But Jake caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, something that made him wonder if there was more to the situation than he had realized. For a moment, Jake was at a loss for words. He had assumed the girl was just another survivor, but there was something unusual about her, something different. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it was like she had an old soul trapped in a child's body. And yet it wasn't just her maturity that made him pause. There was an energy about her, something untapped, something raw, that Jake couldn't quite place. Lyra turned back to him, her gaze searching. "You're from Earth, right?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet curiosity. "Yeah," Jake said. "I am." The girl's eyes lit up as if she had discovered a hidden treasure. "I knew it," she said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "I knew you were different." Jake blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Lyra took a step closer, her small form standing confidently before him. "I don't look like the others here. I don't look like anyone here." She pointed to her own mixed skin tone. "I'm a child of two worlds. My mother is from this planet. She was from a tribe that lived here before the warlords came. And my father was from Earth, just like you." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "Your father was from Earth." His voice was barely a whisper. Lyra nodded. "Yes. And I think that makes me like you. We're both from two worlds, right?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Jake didn't know what to say. He had just met this little girl, yet somehow he felt an instant connection to her. It was like the weight of her words had somehow tied him to this place in a way he never expected. Fischela stepped forward, her voice stern. "This child's story is not ours to tell, Jake. Do not be fooled by appearances. There are dangers even here." But Jake wasn't listening. His thoughts were elsewhere. He looked at Lyra again, this time seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a child of two worlds, just like him. And in that moment, Jake realized that the world he had been thrown into wasn't just a place of endless danger and survival. It was a place where unexpected connections could form, where people from different worlds could find each other in the most unlikely of ways. As the fire crackled beside them, Jake couldn't help but feel that this journey had only just begun. Jake could feel the weight of the universe pressing down on him as he sat next to the campfire. It wasn't just the endless dangers of the alien planet or the constant threat of the Drexian warlords that made him feel this way. It was something more personal. He had been thrown into a world that was completely different from Earth, a world that was not just dangerous but full of new, unexpected challenges. Yet, as he sat by the fire with Fischela and Lyra, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just a survivor, running for his life. He had allies, people who had shared in the struggle and understood the same fight. Together, they would face whatever the galaxy threw at them. The campfire crackled, sending small embers up into the air. Fischela was standing at the edge of the camp, her sharp eyes scanning the dark horizon. Her red armor gleamed in the firelight, and her stance was as vigilant as always. Jake admired her strength and resilience. She was everything he wasn't: a warrior, a fighter, someone who had lived through wars and battles that he could hardly begin to imagine. But there was a side of her that Jake had seen, a side that wasn't so invincible, so cold. She cared about the people she protected, and she had taken him into her care without hesitation. That meant something. Lyra was sitting beside him, her legs crossed in front of her as she stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the warm glow. She seemed far older than her years, as if she had lived multiple lifetimes in her short life. Her mysterious connection to Earth only added to the weight of the situation. She was a child of two worlds, his world and this one, and that made Jake wonder what kind of future lay ahead for her, for all of them. What was the galaxy really like, and what did it mean for someone like her to be caught between two worlds? Jake pulled himself out of his thoughts and turned to look at her. "Lyra," he said gently, "how do you feel about all this? You're not exactly like the others here." Lyra looked up at him, a serious look in her eyes. "I know what you mean," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I've always felt different. I don't quite fit in anywhere. But that doesn't mean I don't belong. I have my own place in this galaxy." She paused for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. "And so do you. All of us do. We're not just survivors, Jake. We're part of something bigger." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if he was ready to embrace whatever bigger thing Lyra was talking about. But in that moment, it felt like she was right. They were more than just a group of people running from danger. Together, they were building something. Something that might just be able to stand up against everything the galaxy had to throw at them. Vishala turned toward them, her sharp eyes focusing on Jake and Lyra. "We need to stay sharp," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "The warlords won't stop. They never do. We've escaped them before, but they will find us again." Jake nodded. He had been listening to her speak about the warlords for days now, learning everything he could about the ruthless band of marauders who controlled most of the galaxy. They were vicious and powerful, and they didn't take kindly to those who defied them. Jake wasn't used to fighting people like that. On Earth, it was different. There was law, there were rules. But out here in space, it felt like the rules didn't apply. Everything was survival. And in survival, there were no guarantees. "I know," Jake said, his voice steady despite the unease he felt. "But we've gotten out before. We've done it. We just need to keep moving, stay ahead of them." Vishala gave him a sharp look, as if assessing his resolve. "It's not that simple. You may think running is enough, but it isn't. You've seen what they do. You've seen the destruction they leave behind. They will hunt us down until we're nothing but ash." Jake's jaw tightened. He could see the truth in her words. The warlords were unstoppable, a force of nature that left devastation wherever they went. It was a terrifying thought. But there was something else Vishala wasn't saying, something that Jake had sensed all along. She wasn't just afraid for their survival. She was afraid that they wouldn't be able to stop the warlords at all. "You're right," Jake admitted. "But running isn't the answer. We can't keep running forever. We need to fight back." The words felt strange as they left his mouth. Fighting wasn't something Jake was used to. He had always avoided conflict, choosing to find ways around it rather than confronting it head-on. But out here, in this alien world, he had learned that running only worked for so long. Sooner or later, he would have to stand his ground. Lyra glanced up at them, her eyes sharp. "You're talking about fighting back, aren't you?" she asked, her voice almost amused. "You're right, Jake. Running can only get you so far." Jake looked at her, a bit surprised. Lyra, despite her young age, was far wiser than he had given her credit for. "Yeah, I guess that's what I'm talking about," he said, nodding. "But we can't do it alone. We need help." Vishala shook her head, her gaze hard. "No one will help us. The warlords have too much power. No one will risk entering them, especially not for a few survivors. But Lyra wasn't so quick to dismiss the idea. Maybe not now, she said, her voice thoughtful. But we don't have to fight them alone. There are others out there, other groups who might join us. If we show them that we're strong, that we can stand up to the warlords, maybe they'll come to our side. Jake considered her words. It made sense. The warlords couldn't be the only force in the galaxy. There had to be other groups, other survivors, who felt just as helpless against their tyranny. If they could form an alliance, they might stand a chance. The question was, how? How could they convince other groups to join their cause? T'Challa's expression softened, but only slightly. It's risky, she said, but it's better than doing nothing. If we're going to fight back, we'll need all the help we can get. Jake felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger. They weren't just running from the warlords. They were going to challenge them. They were going to fight for a future where people didn't have to live in fear. We need to find allies, Jake said, his voice stronger now. We need to show them that the warlords are not unstoppable. T'Challa nodded. Agreed. But finding allies won't be easy. We'll have to be careful. There are many groups out there, but not all of them will be friendly. Some might want to use us for their own gain. Jake understood the risk. They couldn't trust everyone, and they couldn't afford to make mistakes. But something inside him told him that they had no choice. They had to take this chance. It was the only way they would ever be able to stand against the warlords. The fire flickered again, sending another burst of sparks into the air. For a moment, all was quiet. But then Lyra spoke again, her voice thoughtful. Maybe we don't need to do it alone, she said, her gaze steady. Maybe together, we can take on the galaxy. If we stand united, we can take on the warlords. Not just as individuals, but as a force. We don't need to hide anymore. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. Lyra's words were powerful, filled with conviction. It was as if she could see the future, and in that future, they weren't running. They were fighting back together. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt hope. Real, tangible hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could win. Together, he repeated softly. T'Challa gave him a hard, calculating look, but this time there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of respect. If we do this, we do it right, she said. We'll train, we'll plan, and we'll find allies who are strong enough to fight beside us. Jake nodded. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. They were in this together, and that meant something. As the night stretched on, and the stars twinkled above them, the small group of survivors sat by the fire, ready to face the galaxy, not as scattered, fearful individuals, but as a united front. Together, they would fight back, and together, they would change the galaxy forever.